Police! If you're in here, anybody come out. Police!
At first, it sounded like just another emergency call. Someone reported a young woman in cardiac arrest inside a small apartment. But the moment officers stepped through that doorway, something felt wrong. The room was quiet, almost too quiet, and the people inside couldn't clearly explain what had happened. A 20-year-old woman named Kayla Hamilton lay lifeless on the floor, marks visible around her neck, while confusion and panic filled the room. But what investigators didn't realize yet was that Kayla had already left behind a chilling clue. Just hours before her death, she made a desperate call, a voicemail that captured the terrifying final moments of her life, and unknowingly pointed directly to her killer. When officers arrived at the small house on East Inca Street that afternoon, they expected a routine emergency call. Dispatch had reported a possible cardiac arrest, but the moment they stepped inside, it was clear something about this scene was very different. Inside the room lay 20-year-old Kayla Marie Hamilton. She was already gone. The first people officers encountered were several men who lived in the house. One of them, Hector Ortiz, immediately identified himself as Kayla's fiancé. He appeared confused and overwhelmed, explaining that he had just returned from work and discovered her like this. According to him, everything had been normal earlier in the day. But as officers began asking simple questions, the situation quickly became chaotic. The biggest problem investigators faced right away was communication. Several people in the house spoke very little English, and the officers did not speak Spanish. Questions had to be repeated, translated, and sometimes misunderstood entirely. Basic details that detectives normally gather within minutes suddenly became slow and fragmented. Still, officers tried to piece together a timeline. Hector said Kayla had called him earlier that morning, around 11 a.m. He wasn't sure exactly what she wanted, only that she had tried to reach him. Later in the afternoon, when he returned home from work, he walked into the room and found her unresponsive. He told officers something else that immediately caught their attention. Kayla's hands had been tied. He explained that when he first saw her, there had been a cord around her neck, and her hands appeared bound. This was not a medical emergency. This was a homicide scene. Kayla Hamilton was only 20 years old. She was known by friends and family as a kind and gentle person. She was also autistic, which made the tragedy even more heartbreaking for the community trying to understand how something like this could happen to her. And it had happened in broad daylight. The apartment itself was crowded. Multiple people rented rooms in the house, and several of them were present when police arrived. With so many individuals connected to the location, investigators knew the answer could be anywhere in that building. Naturally, their first focus was Hector. In many homicide investigations, the person closest to the victim is the first person detectives examine closely. Hector's reactions were being carefully observed. Some officers noted that he didn't seem as emotional as they might expect from someone who had just found their partner dead. But investigators also understood that people react differently to shock and trauma. Strange behavior alone doesn't prove guilt, so they continued gathering information. As officers asked about Kayla's life, Hector explained they had been together for 2 years. According to him, their relationship was stable. They didn't drink, didn't use drugs, and were planning a future together. They had even recently purchased a car and were talking about getting married. When officers asked whether Kayla had any enemies, Hector shook his head. No, he insisted. She was really nice. Nothing about her lifestyle suggested she would be the target of violence. There were no signs of robbery either. Nothing appeared stolen from the room, except for one very important item. Kayla's phone was missing. That detail would soon become critical. As investigators continued questioning everyone inside the house, they learned something else strange. There was another person who lived there, a young man who rented a room in the same house, and he was nowhere to be found. Even more concerning, no one seemed to know much about him. The roommates struggled to remember his name. Some described him as quiet. Others said he mostly kept to himself. He had only recently moved in, and no one had built much of a relationship with him. But someone eventually remembered it. Walter Martinez. At that moment, officers didn't know whether Walter had anything to do with Kayla's death, but the fact that he lived in the house and was suddenly missing immediately raised questions. Meanwhile, investigators turned their attention back to something Hector had mentioned earlier, the voicemail. Hector explained that Kayla had sent him a voice message earlier in the day. At first, he hadn't thought much about it, but when he listened again, something about it disturbed him. Officers asked to hear it. When they pressed play, the room fell silent. The audio was chilling. In the background, Kayla could be heard struggling. There were sounds of choking and gasping for air. It sounded like someone was attacking her while the recording was happening. Then, near the end of the voicemail, something even more unsettling appeared. A male voice. The voice spoke briefly in Spanish before the message ended. For investigators, that recording changed everything. This wasn't just evidence of a struggle. It was a recording of the crime itself. Kayla, in a desperate moment, had managed to leave behind a clue from the middle of the attack. Without realizing it, she had documented the very moment someone was taking her life. But one problem still remained. The phone that contained the original message was gone, and whoever had taken it might have been the same person who had just disappeared from the house. As investigators processed the scene, another critical development unfolded. Officers were still trying to locate Kayla's missing phone, the device that could potentially contain even more evidence from her final moments. Then an update came through. The phone had been found, but not inside the house. It had been discovered nearby, lying on train tracks not far from the property. That detail immediately raised new questions. Whoever took the phone clearly didn't want it to be found inside the house. Tossing it onto the tracks suggested someone had tried to dispose of it quickly after the crime. Meanwhile, officers were still searching for the missing roommate, Walter Martinez. Not long after, another officer radioed in with unexpected news. Someone matching Walter's description had just been spotted walking near the neighborhood. Officers quickly moved in and detained him. Within moments, they confirmed his identity. The missing roommate was now in custody. Walter Martinez was only 16 years old. He was brought to the police station for questioning, where detectives prepared to begin an interrogation. Because Walter spoke limited English, another officer assisted as a translator while the conversation was recorded on camera. At the start, Walter appeared calm, almost confused about why he had been brought in. When detectives asked if he knew why he was there, he simply said, "No." Investigators began with basic questions. They asked how long he had been in the United States. Walter explained that he had arrived only a few months earlier after being smuggled into the country from El Salvador. According to him, he had been living in the rented room at the house because his stepbrother knew the landlord. When detectives asked about his day, Walter claimed he had been out walking in a nearby park. That, he said, was the reason he wasn't home when police arrived. But investigators were careful not to reveal too much information during the interview. Instead, they allowed Walter to keep talking, watching closely for inconsistencies in his story. At one point, Walter asked something that caught the detectives' attention. He asked whether he would still be able to return to the house. The question seemed oddly timed. Detectives wondered why he was already concerned about going back there when the investigation had only just begun. Meanwhile, forensic evidence from the scene was being processed, and when those results came back, the case changed instantly. DNA evidence recovered from Kayla's clothing matched Walter Martinez. Investigators also received confirmation from the medical examiner that Kayla had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. The evidence was overwhelming. What started as a confusing scene filled with language barriers and unanswered questions now pointed clearly to one person, the quiet roommate no one knew much about. Eventually, Walter Martinez confessed to the crime. Prosecutors later revealed disturbing details about his background. He had been smuggled into the United States just 4 months before the murder and had been loosely connected to the violent gang MS-13. In court, the case moved quickly once the evidence was presented. Walter Martinez eventually pleaded guilty. In 2025, at the age of 19, he was sentenced to 70 years in prison for the murder and sexual assault of Kayla Hamilton. But the story didn't end there. During the investigation, authorities intercepted a letter Walter had written from jail to a pastor in El Salvador. In that letter, he claimed responsibility for 4 additional murders and 2 more sexual assaults. The case shocked communities across the country and eventually sparked political debate. Lawmakers later introduced legislation known as the Kayla Hamilton Act, aimed at addressing gaps in how unaccompanied migrant minors are processed by federal agencies. For Kayla's mother, Tammy Nobles, none of that could undo what had happened. Her daughter, a young woman with dreams, a future, and a life ahead of her, had been taken in a brutal and senseless attack. Yet in the middle of that tragedy, Kayla unknowingly left investigators one final piece of evidence, that voicemail. In her final moments, while fighting for her life, Kayla managed to capture the sounds of the attack that would eventually lead detectives to the person responsible. In a heartbreaking way, she helped solve her own case. If you found this case as shocking and heartbreaking as it is, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think investigators would have solved this case as quickly without that voicemail? And if you want to see more real investigations like this one, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who enjoys true crime stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next case.